In this video, I'm going to go over Carl Jung's link between instincts and the archetypes. So as we understand this link between instincts and archetypes, you'll be able to further understand Jung's conceptualization of the collective unconscious. So if you're interested in understanding more about Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, then you're going to really enjoy this video and you're going to be able to kind of understand it with more clarity, I think, because this is a good way to conceptualize what he's talking about in regards to the collective unconscious. So what I'm going to first do is go over Jung's outline for understanding his definition of instincts, and then that's going to help us a lot to understand how it relates to the archetypes, okay? And so basically, first off, if you've watched any of my other videos on Jung, you'll understand that he always takes a psychological viewpoint of things. So he's focused on the psychological aspect of the problem here. And so again, in this text, he's again focused on the psychological aspect. And so he's saying that he's going to look at the instincts psychologically. He's not going to look at them biologically. All right. So that's a distinction that Jung makes in this text. And at first, I was kind of critical of that, because if you think about it, how can you dislodge the psychology from the biology? In my mind, I think that to get a fuller picture of the whole situation or the problem, you have to really look at the biology and psychology. Nonetheless, Jung does admit his failings here. He says here, in regards to him focusing on the psychological aspect, he says, I must naturally confine myself to this aspect of the question, because I do not feel competent to treat the problem of instinct under its biological aspect. All right. So then at the end of the text here, he does go on to, it does mention in the footnotes that, let me just find it here. He mentions in the footnotes, the biological side of the problem is discussed in Alvarez. Now, it's a German text and name, so I'm not going to read it out, but I'll put it on the screen. So the biological side of the problem is discussed in that text. So I guess Jung just leaves it up to the biologists to care about that side of the equation for as far as instincts are concerned, okay? So Jung, being a psychologist or a psychiatrist, is going to focus on the psychological aspect of instinct. And so that's what he's going to do here. So I thought I'll just point that out at the beginning so that there's no confusion. Also, if you want to read along with me, everything from this video is from The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche in Collected Works, Volume 8, paragraph 26, 263 to 282. All right, if you want to follow along there. So let's get into it now. Understanding that, he starts off with invoking the idea of the all or none reaction, which is formulated by Rivers. All right, so the all or none reaction is kind of a way to describe what an instinct is and how it operates, and how we can differentiate it from other things, all or none. So it's either it is there or it's not, okay? Its presence is going to be known or it's not, all right? And even though Jung finds this useful and he's going to use this to uncover different, instinctual aspects of the psyche, he also critiques it because he knows that it's not fully representative of the actual phenomena or the actual process or mechanism. And then he critiques Rivers' conceptualization of the all or none reaction by saying that there is no gradation of intensity in respect for the circumstances which provoke it. All right, so which means that there's no gray area, there's no spectrum. It's just either all or none. Okay, it's black or white. So I think Jung critiques that because he wants to keep it open. He wants the inquiry of investigation or the understanding of the phenomena to be kind of more broad. But at the same time, he finds lots of use in the concept of the all or none reaction formulated by Rivers, in understanding and differentiating an instinct from other psychological processes. Okay, so that's why he invokes that idea at the start of this text. All right. So then what he does is he basically defines instincts. All right, and he says an instinct is unconscious. All right, so it's an unconscious process. All right, it's defined by that because it has an unconscious motive and aim. Okay, motive and aim of instinct is unconscious. Okay, and so, but what he wants to do is he wants to say, just because it's unconscious, it doesn't mean that it's defined by unconsciousness. It doesn't mean that everything that is unconscious is an instinct. Okay, so he wants to differentiate instinct as an unconscious process, an unconscious content from other unconscious processes or contents. Okay, and so he's going to continue to differentiate what an instinct is so that we can tell the difference between an instinct and other unconscious processes. And so basically, he also says that they're erupt. So they just, they're an erupt psychic occurrence. So they disrupt the conscious continuity of thought. All right. They're like an obscure necessity. Okay. And that's kind of how we discover them, how we can understand their nature, is that they kind of override our conscious thought. Okay. Out of necessity, born out of necessity. And he also says that it's defined as inner necessity, which is also the definition of instinct given by Kant, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. Jung is heavily influenced by Kant, in fact, in many ways, and you can see Kantian kind of connotations to many of Jung's ideas, all right? And so that's that there, right? Now he moves on a little bit and he shows that we need a differentiation, okay? Because a clear instinct is the fear response to a snake, all right? So we have humans have a fear response to a snake, and we know it's an instinct because we can see that simple reaction in monkeys as well. They have the exact same fear response to snakes. And so it's a simple instinct that we have in response to a particular stimuli, all right? And so what this phenomena has as part of its characteristics is that it has uniformity of the phenomenon, okay? So it happens uniformly, like in the same way every single time it occurs, okay? And it regularly occurs, so its occurrence is regular, all right? So there's the two things, uniformity and regularity, all right? And that's what makes up, that's what's characteristic of the qualities of instinctive action, all right? And so that example of the snake is compared to, say, someone who has a phobia around a hen. There's like a harmless chicken or a hen or whatever, right, running around, and someone might have a phobia, a fear reaction to that hen, but it's not uniform. Not everyone who interacts with a hen acts in that way, okay? And it's also not regular. Well, it might be regular for that individual, but the way in which the individual reacts to the hen may not always be defined so regularly as in comparison to us reacting to a snake, okay? So so we can separate between phobias and general expressions of depression and anxiety, okay? We can differentiate between them and an instinct, okay? So that's the point there that he's trying to make. He gives those examples, all right? And so I'm just going to read this quote here. Only those unconscious processes which are inherited and occur uniformly and regularly can be called instinctive. All right. And so basically, they're the parameters around the definition of instinct, all right, and how we can differentiate it from other unconscious processes. So now Jung moves on from defining his terms to now kind of inquiring a bit deeper with this knowledge. So he now wants to understand, like, well, where do instincts come from? Okay, and so this is a quote here by Jung. The question of where instincts come from and how they were acquired is extraordinarily complicated. The fact that they are invariably inherited does nothing to explain their origin. It merely shifts the problem back to our ancestors. Okay, so basically, just because we know that they're inherited, that doesn't mean we know much about how they arrived to become what they are. Okay, and so it's hypothesized, and it was strongly viewed, at least in Jung's time, that instincts originated in the individual, and then general acts of will. Okay, so individuals, and then just in general, lots of individuals, I guess, through their acts of will, and continuously repeated behaviors, learned and acquired instincts. Okay, so they basically repeated these behaviors so much that they became innate. Okay, they became, kind of more inbuilt into us as these individuals continuously acted out that function, that particular function or behavior. Okay, so basically relying on learned, repeated activation becoming automatic. All right, and so, but then Jung contrasts this and says, but if that were the case, we wouldn't see other examples in nature, or for example, of the yucca moth. The yucca moth, instinctually, what it does is it pulls out only once this yucca flower, blossoms, and the yucca moth gets some pollen from the yucca flower. It turns it into a little pellet, and then it kind of implants it into another flower in its stem. And it only does that once throughout its lifetime. It's very complicated behavior of action. It only does that once throughout its lifetime. So it doesn't make sense that in that situation, at least, it can't be like a learned behavior from repeated exercise of will that then turned into an automation, because they only ever do it once throughout their lifetime, and the flower only ever blooms once throughout their lifespan. Okay, so that's an idea that contradicts the former idea. And so, but inherent in that yucca moth idea is the idea that there is an imprint or a certain like blueprint that the yucca moth is living out. Okay, a certain pattern that it's following, that's inbuilt into it, that it lives out. All right, and so that's touching on the idea of the archetypes now. All right, and so now Jung moves on, and he contrasts instinct with the concept and idea of intuition. All right, now this contrast will help us move on to Jung's idea between the instincts and the archetypes. All right, so basically he says here that in this contrast, he's saying that instincts are purposive impulse to carry out some highly anticipated action. All right, whereas intuition is unconscious, purposive apprehension of a highly complicated situation. All right, so Jung's conception of intuition is like an unconscious perception of the situation. Okay, so just as we consciously perceive facts and things that are going on, intuition is an unconscious perception and a gathering of information that then is revealed, that then kind of like impedes on our consciousness, and that's how then we are then exposed to the unconscious perception. So we were always perceiving these unconscious stimuli, and we just didn't know it because it wasn't strong enough, or there was not enough energy to break into our conscious awareness. So that's kind of how intuition works in Jung's mind. Okay, so it results in an eruption of consciousness with unconscious content. Okay, it's a sudden idea or like a hunch, like I have a hunch that this is going to happen. Okay, because you've unconsciously perceived other information and stimuli, and an idea is now popped into your consciousness. Okay, and so he says here basically to link instinct with intuition. He says, in a sense, therefore, intuition is the reverse of instinct, neither more or less wonderful than it. Okay, so it's not better than it, it's not worse than it. It's just, it seems to be the reverse, because again, instinct is the purposive impulse to carry out some highly complicated action. Okay, whereas intuition is an unconscious, purposive apprehension of a highly complicated situation. Okay, so action on the one hand and apprehension or perception on the other hand. Okay, so that's Jung's ideas linking instinct to intuition. Okay, now I think it's really important that I read this quote from Jung that explains a lot more about Jung's conceptualization of the archetypes in relation to the instincts. This will give you a great understanding of what he means, all right? So here it is. Here's the quote. But over and above that, we also find in the unconscious qualities that are not individually acquired but are inherited, example, instincts as impulses to carry out actions from necessity without conscious motivation. In this deeper stratum, we also find the a priori inborn forms of intuition, namely the archetypes of perception and apprehension, which are the necessary a priori determinants of all psychic processes. Just as his instincts compel man to a specifically human mode of existence, so the archetypes force his ways of perception and apprehension into specifically human patterns. The instincts and the archetypes together form the collective unconscious. I call it collective because unlike the personal unconscious, it is not made up of individual and more or less unique contents, but of those which are universal and of regular occurrence. Instinct is an essentially collective, i.e. universal and regularly occurring phenomenon, which has nothing to do with individuality. Archetypes have this quality in common with the instincts and are likewise collective phenomena. In my view, the question of instinct cannot be dealt with psychologically without considering the archetypes, because at bottom, they determine one another. Okay, so that basically just describes exactly what Jung's view is there. Okay, so just to kind of tease that out a little bit or rummage around in that a little bit is, check this out. When he says, in the deeper stratum, we also find the a priori inborn forms of intuition, namely the archetypes of perception and apprehension, which are the necessary a priori determinants of all psychic processes. Now, in layman's terms, what I would say that is we have an inbuilt structure of the mind. Okay, we have inbuilt categories of the mind that are inborn in us, just as we have instincts that drive our actions. We have instincts of the mind. Okay, That's basically what I see from that. And so when he says a priori, it kind of hints to Kant and Kant's notion of a priori categories. And he says inborn forms of intuition. That's hinting at Plato and the Platonic forms, okay? So I thought I'd point that out there because he's drawing upon philosophical ideas and he's trying to use them to conceptualize, to show you the conceptualization of what he means here. And even the word archetype is from, I've lost it right now, but Augustine, Saint Augustine, he steals the word archetype from there as well. So he's gathering together all the different ideas here to describe what he's talking about. Okay, so the determinants of all psychic processes. So he sees it as these instinctive, these like kind of instincts of the mind. Okay, that's the way I see it. An easy way to explain that. So what else have we got here? Now, he also then kind of goes through, are there many instincts or just a few instincts? Because in his time, they were arguing over that. There's just a few instincts, but William James thought there was more, instincts, like multiple instincts, whereas other people just viewed instincts more like the same as, just these little like reflex impulses. But Jung viewed them as more than just the reflex impulses, and that limitation was too limiting of a view. So basically here you can see these are the coinciding matching ideas, typical modes of action, typical modes of apprehension or perception. Okay, uniform, regularly reoccurring, typically unconscious, typically unconscious. I said typically because, if you think about it, you can be conscious of it only if you want to be conscious of it, or if you really try hard. And even if you try to do that, you're not always going to be able to nail down, when a particular archetype is living itself out in your life. Okay, but the whole idea of Jung's work, in a sense, is to become conscious of the archetypal unconscious kind of forces that are controlling or determining your fate, in a sense. And as a part of that, as a part of understanding, these unconscious processes, he shows how what we've done throughout history is there's been an intellectualization of archetypes throughout history. Okay, and now I'll go into that. I'll just read this quote here. We are in a far better position to observe instincts in animals or in primitives than in ourselves. This is due to the fact that we have grown accustomed to scrutinizing our own actions and to seeking rational explanations for them. Okay, so here now, as we understand, Jung is talking about the intellectualization of archetypes throughout history. He says that instincts have been domesticated. All right, so yes, they're instincts, but because of the development of our rationality and our ability to rationalize and make things conscious, we have domesticated some of our instincts. Okay, that's also kind of plays into Freud's understanding of sexuality and how we kind of have domesticated sexuality as well in that sense. So that's an example there of the domestication of instincts. And basically here, what Jung wants to point out, though, is the problem of intellectualization of archetypes and instincts is that we have succeeded in enveloping a large number of instincts in rational explanations to the point where we can no longer recognize the original motive behind so many veils. In this way, it seems as though we possessed practically no instincts anymore. All right? And so he's saying, because we've intellectualized it so much, we're not conscious. We're not actually conscious of what is an instinct and what is just our rationalization of these things, because the way our rational thought is organized is in such a way where we kind of justify everything, all right, in and of its own reasoning kind of thing. And in that sense, we separate ourselves from the underlying structures of our psyche, all right? That's what Jung's talking about. And then he goes on to say, but now he's going to apply Rivers' criterion of the all or none reaction that I was talking about in the beginning of this video, okay? And so this is how we're going to understand that we're still dealing with instincts and archetypes, all right? If we apply the Rivers' criterion of the disproportionate all or none reaction to human behavior, we find innumerable cases where exaggerated reactions occur. Exaggeration, indeed, is a universal human peculiarity. Although everybody carefully tries to explain his reactions in terms of rational motives, there is never any lack of good arguments, but the fact of exaggeration remains. All right. So he's basically saying, there's no shortage of good arguments. We can always rationalize something, but the fact that basically, well, he says it good here. Just as much as is needed. And why is it that a man does not do or say, give or take, just as much as is needed or reasonable or justifiable in a given situation, but frequently so much more or less, precisely because an unconscious process is released in him that runs its course without the aid of reason, and therefore falls short of or exceeds the degree of rational motivation. So you see here that he's pointing out that the irrational undermines the irrational functioning of our instinctive qualities of human behavior as they manifest and show as a phenomena, show that our irrational side, our instinctive side, undermines our rationality a lot of the time. Because if we were purely rational and able to operate in a strict rational means, we wouldn't see this exaggerated effect that underpins the all or none reaction, the disproportionate all or none reaction. That's what it means, because it's all or none. It's like it's like triggering off an instinct, and it just takes over. All right. So we're not completely rational. We're made up of these irrational instinctive processes. All right. And so that's what Jung is talking about here. That's how he's using that Rivers' criterion to point that out. All right. So we can rat out and find what is instinctive and what is archetypal. All right. As opposed to a rationalization. Okay. So Jung now continues to go through the history, like a quick history of philosophy, and kind of does a quick overview of the rationalization of archetypes themselves. All right, so I'm going to read this out because I think that this is really valuable to understand Jung's conceptualization of what has happened to the archetypes across time, and why it's hard for us to understand and break through kind of to understand really the phenomena that he's talking about, because our rationalization, the way that we normally think, has kind of blinded us to understanding what these primordial forms or archetypes are. All right. So here's the quote by Jung. In Plato, however, an extraordinarily high value is set on the archetypes as metaphysical ideas, as paradigms or models, while real things are held to be only the copies of these model ideas. Medieval philosophy, from the time of Saint Augustine, from whom I have borrowed the idea of the archetype, down to Malebranche, I don't know, and Bacon, still stands on a Platonic footing in this respect, but in scholasticism, we find the notion that archetypes are natural images engraved on the human mind, helping it to form its judgments. Thus, Herbert and Cherbury says natural instincts are expressions of those faculties which are found in every normal human, through which the common notions touching the internal conformity of things, such as the cause, means, and purpose of things, the good, bad, beautiful, pleasing, etc., are brought into conformity independently of discursive thought. From Descartes to Malebranche onwards, the metaphysical value of the idea or archetype steadily deteriorated. It became thought, an internal condition of cognition, as clearly formulated by Spinoza. By idea, I understand a conception of the mind, which the mind forms by reason of its being a thinking thing. Finally, Kant reduced the archetypes to a limited number of categories of understanding. Schopenhauer carried the process of simplification still further, while at the same time endowing the archetypes with an almost Platonic significance. In this all too summary sketch, we can see once again that some psychological process at work, which disguises the instincts under the cloak of rational motivations and transforms the archetypes into rational concepts. It is hardly possible to recognize the archetype under this guise. Okay, so basically Jung there shows how these primordial images that are the perception of the instincts are being covered up through higher order thinking of rationalization of them. All right, and then it makes us cloudy to be able to see what they really are. All right, and then down here he says, I think this is important. Just as we have been compelled to postulate the concept of an instinct determining or regulating our conscious actions, so in order to account for the uniformity and regularity of our perceptions, we must have recourse to the correlated concept of a factor determining the mode of apprehension. It is this factor which I call the archetype or primordial image. The primordial image might suitably be described as the instinct's perception of itself, or as the self-portrait of the instinct, in exactly the same way as consciousness is an inward perception of the objective life process. Just as conscious apprehension gives our action form and direction, so unconscious apprehension through the archetype determines the form and direction of instinct. If we call instinct refined, then the intuition which brings the instinct into play, in other words, the apprehension by means of the archetype, must be something incredibly precise. And then he talks about the yucca mouth in reference to this. Thus, the yucca mouth must carry within it an image, as it were, of the situation that triggers off its instinct. This image enables it to recognize the yucca flower and its structure, etc. Okay, so that's interesting there, that the archetype or the primordial images or the inner intuition, so to speak, is the perception of instinct itself. Okay, and that it's like this other. It's like a consciousness within. It's like the consciousness of instinct. Okay, and it's an interesting idea. Anyway, okay, so that's that there, and then I'll finish it on this because Jung sums it up here, and he says, the collective unconscious consists of the sum of the instincts and their correlates, the archetypes. Okay, so Jung views the collective unconscious as making up of the instincts and the archetypes, or the perception of the instincts, or the instincts' self-perception. Okay, and that's similar to how we have our internal perception that we have of the conscious objective world here. Okay, the instincts have a perception of the archetypes. The instincts have a perception, and that perception is the archetypes. Okay, and so then it says here, just as every body possesses instincts, so he also possesses a stock of archetypal images. The most striking proof of this is the psychopathology of mental disturbances that are characterized by an eruption of the collective unconscious. Such is the case in schizophrenia. Here we can often observe the emergence of archaic impulses in conjunction with unmistakable mythological images. In my view, it is impossible to say which comes first, apprehension of the situation or the impulse to act. It seems to me that both are aspects of the same vital activity, which we have to think of as two distinct processes simply for the purpose of better understanding. So in the end there, Jung is trying to distinguish between instincts and archetypes, and he basically says that he thinks it's better to view them as two distinct processes for the purpose of better understanding. And I think what he means there is that if we just look at them as kind of, like if we can look at them as distinct different things, we'll be able to understand what they are, differentiated from each other. But I don't really know how he gets away with separating them if they're the same as how I see the biology and psychology. I don't think really should be separated. We should see them as together, as one problem, as I think this should be one problem. But he kind of says it'll give us better understanding if we see them as distinct processes. And I think I understand what he means. I think he means that then if we can see them as separate, we can differentiate between them, because the instincts, being modes of action, he's saying here he doesn't know which one comes first, the impulse to act or the apprehension of the situation, the perception of it. So the perception can shape this inner primordial image of the archetype, can shape the mode of action. Okay, and actually could be the mechanism of which that actually shapes the action that we view as instinctive behavior. All right, so that's what he's kind of pointing at there. I think that's why he makes a differentiation, so we can look at these different things. And so Jung would point to archaic impulses that manifest mythological images. So he would point to basically to medieval and beyond, because that was before rationalization, pretty much, right? So before the rationalization took over, we can view the projection of the archetypes in the more less developed cultures, so that we can have an understanding of how the psyche evolved, because they projected the typical modes of apprehension that was unconsciously projected into their mythologies. Okay, so that's why Jung values mythology so much, because he believes through an analysis of mythology and comparative mythology, you can see the uniform and the regularity and the unconscious content that these people are projecting unconsciously into their mythology. Okay, and so he's saying by viewing the apprehension or the unconscious perception, we could maybe see how that could influence the action. But he admits to his failings here in knowing really what is happening, because he's just making educated guesses. Okay, so Jung's using all the information he has, and he's making educated guesses almost philosophically. Okay, so he doesn't know which one influences which one, but they're both integral and important to the collective unconscious. Okay, so this kind of led me a little bit, feeling like I wanted to understand more. So if you feel like that right now, then that's great. We're going to continue to learn more about Carl Jung. So if you like this video, please subscribe. Please share it with other people on social media platforms, Facebook or whatever. That really does help me a lot. And please leave some comments, because that helps me as well. And I'd like to see what you think, or what your questions, or what you'd like to find out as I continue to investigate more into Carl Jung. So this essay kind of ends there. And so, but I think there's more. This has given us more questions than answers in a sense. And so that's always good with Jung. That's what he does. He provokes thought, and it helps us to get excited about inquiring about these different issues and what's going on. So I hope that this video made sense, and something was clear to you about how Jung conceptualized these different concepts. So let me know in the comments if it was clear to you, kind of how Jung was conceptualizing the instincts and archetypes specifically. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.